Hi there, my name is Eric, and this is a presentation on ISO and digital photography. What exactly is ISO? Well, ISO stands for International Standards Organization. It uses a series of numbers to represent the sensitivity of a digital sensor or to light. ISO is based on the old ASA system, except that now it is a universally accepted method for indicating media sensitivity to light. There are no units for ISO. What does an ISO of 100 mean? An ISO of 100 is often the base or lowest setting for ISO on most current digital cameras. When shooting in full sunlight, an ISO of 100 will allow you to get a proper exposure at f16 and 1/100th of a second. This is also known as the Sunny 16 rule. In well-lit situations, an ISO of 100 allows the sensor to deliver the best quality image possible. Consider keeping your ISO set to 100 and altering it as needed. We'll talk more about that in a bit. ISO affects the sensitivity of the camera's sensor to light. So the image to the left was photographed at an ISO of 1600. This meant that the camera's sensor needed less light to capture the desired image. This resulted in a faster shutter speed, preventing blur from camera motion. Some shots are just not going to be possible unless you bump up ISO. ISO and exposure. Doubling or halving ISO changes the exposure by one stop. It's an easy to remember formula. This particular photograph was shot with an ISO of 400, allowing me a 1/1000th of a second shutter speed. If I changed the ISO to 100, it would allow me a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. That's 2 stops lower. If I changed it to an ISO of 1600, it would allow a shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second. That's 2 stops faster. When ISO values double, the amount of light needed to achieve the same exposure is half. This allows for faster shutter speeds and or smaller apertures. Flash distances go further, assuming that flash sync speed is not reached. This may mean that a flash or tripod is no longer required, and it may mean that camera shake is no longer an issue. This particular shot was of a guitarist from the band Smash Mouth. When ISO values halve, the amount of light needed to achieve the same exposure is double. This means using slower shutter speeds or wider open apertures. Flash distances do not travel as far. It goes 70% less per stop. It may mean that a flash or tripod is required if slow shutter speeds are happening. May increase the chance of camera shake with lower shutter speeds. This is a photograph of a lizard I shot on the island of Tortuga. So why not use higher ISO values all the time? Higher ISO values means faster shutter speeds, better depth of field, and greater flash distance, meaning that you don't need a tripod or even vibration reduction mechanisms. It sounds like a winner. This photograph here is an enlargement of the eye that you see on the bird to the left. So the whole thing has to do with this thing called noise. Well, what is noise? Noise can be thought of as pixels of the wrong color and shade that represent an image being captured. Bright light hitting a sensor set at a low ISO value will produce a strong electric signal, and it will have little or no noise in the background. As ISO increases, the amount of light needed to make the exposure decreases. This allows the background signal, which we call noise, to be expressed. This results in an image with less detail. In photography, we say that as ISO increases, the signal-to-noise ratio decreases. At extremely high ISOs, the noise overpowers the signal completely, such that the production of an image is impossible, or at the very least, extremely poor. You can think of it as using rabbit ears to capture a signal from an old television. The signal from nearby stations is strong because it has to travel a short distance. Electronic background noise in the TV is weak in comparison, so it can't be seen. Signals from distant stations are weak because they have to travel such a long distance, and the electronic background noise in the TV is strong compared to that, and interferes with the signal, producing a poor image. This here is a graphical representation of sensor noise and the signal coming in from light. When you've got a very low ISO and you've got a strong signal, it overpowers whatever noise exists within the sensor. But when you have a very weak signal, the ISO, the noise inside the sensor, is very strong compared to it, and so that's why you start to see these various issues. Have a look at this table. And the interesting thing about this is that every one of these exposures is exactly the same in terms of the amount of light hitting the sensor. What's different is the shutter speed, the aperture, or the ISO, or some combination thereof. Each of these produces a different effect in the photograph. You might want to pause the video and have a look at specifics. What affects noise besides ISO? Anything that affects the baseline signal or reduces the input signal will increase noise in an image. High ISO values is one of the main contributors to noise. The higher the ISO, the more noise is present. Your camera may have a high ISO noise reduction filter available. The size of the digital sensor has a huge impact on this. It also affects noise. Larger sensors produce less noise. The length of exposure has a large impact on noise. Longer exposures produce more noise. This is especially true for images over 4 seconds. Your camera may have a long exposure noise reduction filter available. There's a whole pile of other factors which include the generation of the sensor, the ambient temperature, areas of shadow, and there's a few more things. Examples of photos at various ISOs. So what I'm doing here is I've got a number of photographs that I've taken, and I am sharing with you the ISO. This was shot at an ISO of 50. Also an ISO of 50. An ISO of 100 on a tripod, long exposure. An ISO of 100. Lots of light, didn't need to go any faster than that. An ISO of 200. I try to keep my ISOs low, shooting indoor and dim light stuff, but I'll bump it up as needed. In this case, an ISO of 200 was all I needed. ISO of 200. Shooting with a long lens, I find I'm not always getting the shutter speeds I want, so I will often bump up my ISO accordingly. ISO of 400. Pretty dim here, and I needed to freeze action. ISO of 400. It wasn't a bright day, it was a fairly cloudy day, so my shutter speeds were low. ISO of 800. Inside of a museum, poor lighting, you're not allowed to use a tripod. So I had no choice. I had to go handheld and bump up my ISO. Very poor light and very fast moving. Same sort of idea here. This is at the same concert. This is at an ISO of 2200, but I'm using a very, very low minimum aperture value lens, so I'm getting a fast shutter speed with the combination of wide open aperture and fast ISO. Shot inside a museum. You can kind of see the noise on that if you look at that. This was photographed in an aquarium. This is pretty obvious where this was photographed. I used a flash and I bumped up the ISO to give my flash further distance. Another aquarium. This is in a museum. This is light from a fire, and used a very, very high ISO to capture this. Even so, it turned out not too bad. These are glowworms inside of a cave in New Zealand. I used an ISO of 25,600 and a reasonably fast shutter speed so that I didn't get any camera blur. And this is an interesting shot. It's a photograph of a kiwi, literally a kiwi, in a museum type place enclosure. It was very dark in there, couldn't see anything. So even then I'm shooting at a 1/13 of a second. Thanks so much for watching. Appreciate you taking the time to look at this, and check out some of my other presentations. Thanks.